Somewhere in your gut, right now, there's an enzyme working overtime because your ancestors, thousands of years ago, made a bet on rice. And in a lab far away, a totally different gene switched itself on in someone else's body because their ancestors made a bet on milk. Neither bet was better. Both bets kept people alive. And today, scientists are only just starting to understand how much these old survival bets still shape our health, our medicine, and our bodies right now, in the present. For a long time, the simple story of human genetics went like this. All modern humans came from Africa, around 300,000 years ago. Small groups walked out of Africa roughly 70,000 years ago and spread across the planet. Over thousands of years, isolated groups picked up different surface features, skin tone, eye shape, height, hair texture, because of the climates they settled in. But under the skin, scientists mostly assumed we were all running on the same basic genetic blueprint, with only a few minor tweaks here and there. That assumption wasn't wrong exactly. It's true that any two random humans, no matter where their ancestors came from, share about 99.9% of their DNA. Humans are an incredibly young species, genetically speaking, and we are far less genetically diverse than most other animals. But almost identical still leaves room for real, measurable, and sometimes medically important differences. And over the last 2 decades, as genome sequencing got cheaper and faster, researchers started mapping exactly where those differences show up and what they actually do. Let's start with the one most people have actually heard of: milk. Roughly 7,500 to 10,000 years ago, in parts of Europe and a few pockets of Africa and the Middle East, humans began herding cattle and drinking milk regularly. Normally, humans lose the ability to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, after childhood. But a mutation near the gene called LCT lets some adults keep producing the enzyme lactase for their entire lives. In populations where dairy farming took off, that mutation spread incredibly fast, because people who could safely drink milk had access to a reliable, calorie-dense food source, especially during famines or bad harvests. Today, most people with Northern European ancestry can comfortably drink milk as adults. Most people whose ancestors weren't dairy farmers, including large parts of East Asia, West Africa, and indigenous populations in the Americas, cannot, and that's not a flaw. It's simply that their ancestors never needed that particular trick, because milk wasn't a major part of daily survival. Now flip to the other side of the planet. In China and across much of East and Southeast Asia, agriculture took a completely different path. Instead of herding animals for milk, early farmers were cultivating rice, a practice that goes back more than 10,000 years. Some of the oldest confirmed rice farming in the world. A high-starch diet creates a very different kind of evolutionary pressure. And sure enough, researchers found a gene called AMY1, which produces an enzyme called amylase that breaks down starch in your saliva before it even reaches your stomach. In populations with a long history of starch-heavy diets, people tend to carry extra copies of the AMY1 gene. More copies means more amylase, which means more efficient starch digestion. This is a real, well-documented, and completely uncontroversial finding. It shows up in studies comparing rice farming populations in East Asia to populations with different dietary histories, and it lines up neatly with the archaeological record of when rice farming actually began. These two examples, lactase persistence in dairy farming populations and extra AMY1 copies in rice farming populations, are some of the clearest cases scientists have of something called convergent adaptation to diet. Different populations facing different food environments, ending up with different genetic solutions on a surprisingly fast timeline. We're not talking hundreds of thousands of years. Some of these changes spread through populations in just a few thousand years, which in evolutionary terms is incredibly quick. Scientists call this kind of rapid spread a selective sweep, when a mutation is useful enough that it multiplies through a population far faster than random chance would predict. Diet isn't the only place this shows up. Altitude is another great example, and it might be the most dramatic one we've found so far. Tibetan populations live and work at elevations above 4,000 meters, heights where most people would develop severe altitude sickness within days. Researchers eventually traced part of this ability to a variant of a gene called EPAS1, which helps regulate how the body handles low oxygen levels. Here's the twist that made headlines in genetics circles. That particular version of EPAS1 in Tibetans is nearly identical to a version found in Denisovans, an extinct group of ancient humans who lived in Asia tens of thousands of years ago, and are known mostly from a handful of fossil fragments found in a Siberian cave. At some point, ancient humans in Asia interbred with Denisovans, and that gene variant stuck around because it was enormously useful for anyone living at high altitude. Modern Tibetans carry a piece of an extinct human relative in their DNA, quietly helping them breathe. Interestingly, researchers looking at other East Asian populations living at sea level have found different variants in oxygen-related genes too, though nowhere near as extreme as the Tibetan adaptation. These don't give the same dramatic altitude tolerance, but they hint that oxygen metabolism has been fine-tuned differently across different populations, facing different environmental pressures, not just in extreme cases like Tibet. Now here's where this stops being just fun trivia and starts actually mattering for real people in hospitals. All of these genetic differences in digestion, metabolism, and how the body processes different substances don't just affect food, they affect medicine. For decades, the vast majority of drug trials and genetic disease research was conducted primarily on people of European ancestry. It was assumed, often without much testing, that a drug which worked safely and effectively in that population would work the same way for everyone else. As more genetic data came in from populations around the world, that assumption started falling apart. Take type 2 diabetes as an example. In European populations, some of the strongest known genetic risk factors sit in genes like TCF7L2. Those same variants show up far less often or have a much weaker effect in East Asian populations, where different genetic variants turn out to matter more for diabetes risk. That means a genetic risk test built entirely around European data could genuinely miss the real risk factors for someone with East Asian ancestry. Something similar shows up with certain blood pressure medications and specific chemotherapy drugs. They can be metabolized at different rates depending on a person's genetic ancestry, which affects both how well the drug works and how likely someone is to experience side effects. Even something as basic as how quickly your liver breaks down a common pain medication can vary by population, because the enzymes responsible are coded by genes that differ in frequency around the world. This is exactly why more pharmaceutical companies today run separate clinical trials in different populations, rather than assuming one trial fits everyone. It's why some genetic testing companies now build separate risk models for different ancestries instead of one generic score. And it's why medical schools have started teaching population genetics as a normal part of training doctors, not as some fringe topic. None of this is about ranking populations. It's about recognizing that human genetic variation is real. It's regionally patterned because of thousands of years of different environments and diets and diseases. And ignoring that pattern in medicine just means worse healthcare for everyone who doesn't happen to match the population the research was originally built around. There's an important number that tends to get lost in conversations like this, and it's honestly the single most important fact in all of human population genetics. The genetic differences between any two individuals within the same population are, on average, far larger than the average genetic difference between two different populations. If you compared the full genome of two random people from the same city, they would differ from each other more than the average difference between an average person from one country and an average person from another. Populations show different patterns and different frequencies of certain gene variants, shaped by different histories of diet, climate, and disease exposure. But that pattern sits on top of an ocean of shared human variation, not the other way around. This is also exactly why serious researchers in this field are extremely cautious about extending any of this into claims about intelligence, personality, or behavior. The genes involved in things like digestion, oxygen processing, or drug metabolism are relatively simple compared to something like human cognition. Traits like intelligence or personality are shaped by thousands of genes acting together, layered on top of nutrition, education, culture, environment, and pure chance, in ways scientists still don't fully understand even within a single population, let alone between different ones. Whenever you see a claim jump from this population has more copies of a digestion gene to anything about brain differences or behavior between ethnic groups, that's not where the actual science goes. That leap isn't supported by the data, and reputable researchers in this field are careful to say so explicitly, precisely because history has already shown how easily real science can get twisted into pseudoscientific claims used to justify discrimination. So where does that leave us? The honest, evidence-backed picture is this. Human populations really have adapted, genetically, to different environments and different diets over thousands of years. Dairy farmers evolved to digest milk as adults. Rice farmers evolved extra copies of a starch-digesting gene. High-altitude populations picked up ancient genetic material that helps them survive thin air. These differences are real, they're measurable, and they matter for things like disease risk and how our bodies respond to medicine. Recognizing that is not about ranking people or drawing lines between us and them. It's about building better, more personalized medicine that actually works for the full range of human diversity, instead of quietly assuming one group's biology is the default for everyone. That's the real story hiding inside your DNA. Not one grand mystery gene that makes one population different from another, but thousands of small, practical adaptations, each one a quiet record of what a group of humans, somewhere on Earth, had to survive. And the more we map those differences honestly, the better equipped doctors and scientists become at treating every single one of us as the specific, particular person we actually are.